Thank you all for having me here. I think I made a mistake in not coming there. The place looks excellent. So you guys have fun. Here I am sitting sweltering in Madras. Um, so what I thought I would do is in the morning, you've already heard mostly about the seaside, which is, what's in the water, the kind of formations, etc. I don't know, just as one of you can speak up and tell me whether um, the Siddharth and others spoke about how fisher folk make sense of the sea.
No,
No. So they
no.
talked mostly about the ecology. Okay.
Yes, yes.
All right. So let's just start with that a little bit. Would you, in case any of you want to speak, will it be audible?
Yeah, we can. We have the mic, so you can go ahead. We'll pass
Excellent.
the mic
All right.
and you can do
Excellent.
it.
Okay. So to start with, I would like to tell you when you're standing on the beach, what do you think the fisher folk or the fisherman is looking at? And how do you think a fisherman would go and find fish in the sea? It's a very open-ended question. I know a number of you are from the fishing community, so it might be something that you can answer. When the fisherman is standing on the beach or the coast, looking out at the sea, what is it that he's trying to see, and how does he know where to find the fish?
So I'm passing the mic. How does the fisherman actually know that where to catch the fish? How do they know? What does he look at the fish? How does he know?
Hello, I'm Peter.
Yeah, hi,
So,
Peter.
so on my point of view of what I've observed, what the fishermen do, I mean, it is their livelihood. So, should I come to?
No, no, this
So,
fine. I can see you.
yeah, okay. So, it is what they see is their livelihood in the sea, and to locate where the fish is like generational occupation of what they have learned. It's a skill they have been learning for years, which is being passed on from generation to generation. And they not only see the sea as their livelihood, but they have an emotional attachment to it, like what to let's say the tribals have of the forest. So that's there is
Okay.
understanding that I have.
Okay.
Suleiman.
You try and tell me that what are, how do they find where fish is? How do they decide? What are they looking out when they take a decision on whether or not to go fishing? And where will they go to find fish?
It's through the accumulated knowledge of the fishermen which they have acquired over a period of time through learning by doing.
That is fine. But then if they were to break it down for you, what would you, how would you just think commonsensically and let me know what you think? How would you find fish in the sea? In order to find fish, what do you need to know?
So I'm Jason from Kerala.
Yes.
So I'm saying Malayalam. You understand Malayalam?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Trivandrum Malayalam I can understand. Not
Okay.
Malayalam.
Trivandrum.
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay. Yes. Many of sorry. എല്ലാ പൊതുവെ നമ്മുടെ തീരപ്രദേശത്ത് ഞാനും ഒരു ഫിഷർമാന്റെ മകനാണ്. ഞാനും ഈ പറയുന്ന എങ്ങനെയാണ് അവരുടെ ജീവിതം എന്ന് മനസ്സിലാക്കാനായിട്ട് കുറച്ച് ദിവസമെങ്കിലുമൊക്കെ ഈ ഫിഷിങ്ങിന് പോയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു വ്യക്തിയാണ്. അപ്പോ അതിന്റെ കാഴ്ചപ്പാടിൽ പ്രധാനമായിട്ടും ഞങ്ങളുടെ ട്രിവാൻഡ്രത്തെ ഒരു ഫിഷർമാന്റെ ഒരു കോൺടസ്റ്റ് അവര് 3 തരത്തിലുള്ള മത്സ്യബന്ധനങ്ങളിലേക്കാണ് അവർ. ഒന്ന് നമ്മുടെ ഹുക്കർ ലൈൻ ഫിഷിംഗ്, മറ്റേ വല ഉപയോഗിച്ചുകൊണ്ടുള്ള മത്സ്യബന്ധനം, പിന്നെ ഈ പറയുന്ന നമ്മളെ സീഷോർ നെറ്റ്, കരമടി, തട്ടുമടി, കമ്പവല, ലൈക്ക് അത് അത്തരത്തിലുള്ള മത്സ്യബന്ധന രീതികളാണ് അവിടെ കൂടുതലായിട്ട് കണ്ടുവരുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ അതില് ഈ പറയുന്ന അവര് പ്രധാനമായിട്ടും മത്സ്യം എങ്ങനെയാണ് അവര് കണ്ടെത്തുന്നതെന്ന് പറയുമ്പോഴേക്കും ഒന്ന് ജലത്തിന്റെ നമ്മുടെ ഈ പറഞ്ഞ നമ്മളെ എന്താ പറയാ കാക്കകൾ അവിടെ വന്ന് മീൻ ഇങ്ങനെ ചുറ്റി കറങ്ങുന്ന പ്രദേശത്ത് മീനുകൾ ഉള്ളതായിട്ട് പറയുന്നു. പിന്നെ വെള്ളത്തിന്റെ ഒരു നിറവ്യത്യാസത്തിൽ അവർ അവിടെ മീനുകൾ ഉള്ളതായിട്ട് മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നു. പിന്നെ അവര് ട്രഡീഷണലി ദേ ഹാവ് ടു മച്ച് ഇൻഫോർമേറ്റീവ് പേഴ്സൺസ്. അപ്പോൾ അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ നമ്മൾ അവരുടെ ട്രഡീഷണൽ നോളജ് ഉപയോഗിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് അവർ ചില ഏരിയകൾ, അത് കരയും കടലിനെയും ബന്ധിപ്പിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ചില പ്രദേശങ്ങൾ, പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് നമ്മൾ അതിനെ പാരികൾ എന്ന് പറയുന്നു, ആ പാരികൾ കേന്ദ്രീകരിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് പാരികൾ അവരുടെ ഇങ്ങനെ GPS-ഉം മറ്റ് അവരുടെ ട്രഡീഷണൽ നോളജ് വെച്ചുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ, ലൊക്കേഷൻ വെച്ചുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ അവർ ഐഡന്റിഫൈ ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. അത്തരം പ്രദേശങ്ങളിൽ പോയാണ് അവർ പൊതുവെ മീൻ പിടിക്കാറുള്ളത്.
Super.
So I'll just
Thank you. So
translate.
I will, yeah, I will just translate and then continue with this. So yeah, but basically what Jason said is that there's hook and line fishing. So there are different kinds of fishing. There is hook and line fishing. There is shore-based fisheries, and then there is the use of nets. And how they make sense of how they try to what indicators they're looking for. They look at the color of the sea to identify whether that place is likely to have a shoal of fish. They look at birds that are flying in large groups because these might be fish feeding birds, and so they look at that as an indicator to say, okay, there's a shoal of fish there. They also know of places inside the sea. So when we look at, when we say I want to go from here to Mount Road, then we say go straight, turn right, go 3 kilometers, take another road. To take this road and get to this place. In sea, that is not the way they do. They don't talk in distances. They talk in depths. So they'll only speak in fathoms, or they have different words for it in their languages, in their respective languages. So they will talk to you about depths. They will also, what he also said is, in the sea, there are certain places where there are reefs or rocks, submerged mountains underwater mountains or hills or reefs. And these reefs are a habitat. And the fishermen know where those reefs are. They need to know where those reefs are, not only to catch the fish, but also to be very careful about their nets, because the nets might go there, get snagged on a reef, and get spoiled. And these reefs, they will know by depth and by coordinates, which before the GPS came, they would have coordinates by looking at something on land and then, triangulating in order to find that place. But once you go beyond the horizon, you're no longer able to see the land. And then you just have to rely only on astronomical information about the orientation of stars and moon and other heavenly objects. Yes, I think you had a question.
So also what I've heard from the fishermen that I usually work with is that once they get into the deep sea, they also get to see different kinds of colors. The terrain that also changes, which is because of the depth. So that's also a place that they get to see where they exactly get to see the shoal or the kinds of different species of fishes that they could actually catch if it is in the deep sea.
Yeah.
But if it is very close to the shore, some of the information that I've heard during my conversation with them is that because of the kinds of wave patterns, so that helps them to get a near shore catch. And the other one is very close to the mangrove ecosystems where there are estuarine areas. If there are also these inlet of, riverine and a mixture where the ocean and the fresh water mixes. So there is a pattern of change in color during certain periods of the season. So especially during the monsoon, there is, and this is usually from the East Coast because that's where I work. And these are some of the stories that I get to hear.
Sure.
And especially, and the other thing that I've got to hear from a lot of youngsters is that when it's monsoon, they get to catch quite a lot more fish than summer.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Also, what would really help is when you speak, if you can just mention your name, that would be very helpful. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm Meghna, and I'm
Meghna.
an independent researcher.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Meghna. So yeah, so as you can see, the way a fisherman makes sense of the sea and decides whether or not to go, how far to go, whether to take a hook and line or whether to take a net or to not go at all, will depend upon a number of factors. He looks at the sky, he looks at the wind, he looks at the water current. He tries to get a sense of whether the water current is flowing from inside the sea towards the coast or from the coast towards the sea, towards the deep sea. Uh, Once he says, okay, fine, the conditions are favorable, then he goes to the place where he thinks he will find the fish. And that depends upon season and habitat. So just broadly, and this is from my experiences, my learning from the fisher folk friends in Chennai, in the East Coast, there are three kinds of ocean bottoms. The fishermen are not interested in the surface of the sea, except to read the currents and to see. So there are fish that are that swim on the top of the sea. They're called pelagic fishes. Then you have demersal fishes, which are swimming at the bottom of the sea. The fisherman knows what fish swims where. There are three kinds of habitat at the ocean floor. One is sandy, the other is muddy, and the third is reef or rocky. So what Jason referred to as parai in Tamil, par in Malayalam, is a rocky reef. Then you have seru or slush, muddy, and then you have mud, which is sandy. And out of these, the reef and the seru, which is the muddy ocean bottoms, are usually extremely rich because there's more nutrient over there. There are places for, so in a muddy bottom, there are places for animals to burrow themselves. There's again more nutrient over there. Then you have the reefs, which are again places that provide shelter or refuge for small fish, etc. And because there are lots of small fish over there, the large fish come there to prey on them, and then the fisherman goes there. So if you look at it, a fisherman needs to know meteorology, he needs to know ocean hydraulics or hydrology, he needs to know marine biology, he needs to be able to make sense of every damn thing that nature throws at him. And then he needs to make his way to that place and return alive with fish in his hand. So I'm a journalist myself. I also speak to other journalists on issues related to the coast. And they call me to ask me or to ask me to refer them to a scientist who can talk about ocean phenomena. And when I say, here you can speak to Palayamanna, who's a fisherman from Urukupam, they'll say, yeah, we will definitely speak to the fisherman, but we would also like to speak to a scientist. This is a very perverted notion of what science is. Science is not just what you learn in a university or an institute. What is that science that you learn there? You learn a way of knowing. So if I'm a marine biologist and I learn the taxa, the phylum and genera and species, etc., that is one way of knowing the biology of the sea or the natural phenomenon of the sea. There might be a number of other ways in which you can know or relate to the same phenomenon. And so if you look at the fisher folks' way of knowing, it has got a bit of everything, and they have extremely well-developed localized knowledge. So a fisherman from Goa, from say where you guys are near Chorao Island, in that area, they would know the intricacies of that place. And if, let's say, a massive ship is coming, and that person is a master mariner, he's the captain of the ship is a person who knows how to read charts and has a whole range of information. For that person to come into the port or close to the shore and return, they will need the help of local people. It might be fishermen, it might be a local port official, but you need to know the local water conditions to be able to come in. So there's a very highly specialized understanding of local conditions, both in terms of species distribution, in terms of habitats, where these things can be found, etc. And they usually have a mind map of their coast. So when you're going out tomorrow, try and find out from the local fisher folk, what are their most favorite fishing spots. Then ask them, why is that favorite? Is it year long? Most fishing spots are not year long. They are seasonal. So in this season, for instance, right now, the conditions on the East Coast are good for hook and line fishing because the water is clear. And when the water is clear, you can't drop nets in daytime because the fish will be able to see the net. So they do what is called sekkilpadu, which means they go at 4:30, drop the nets at night so the fish don't see the nets and they get caught. Or they go in the daytime for hook and line fishing. And for hook and line fishing, they go to the reefs. And the reefs are maybe at 15 fathoms or 25 fathoms. And they go for certain kinds of fish. Flying fish, it's found now. Sear fish is found now. So if you look at it, these fish are found seasonally. But if you go to the fishing harbors, like the Kasimede fishing harbors or the one in Goa near Panjim, you will find that throughout the year, they catch all kinds of fish. This is hugely problematic because then you start, because if you look at the cuisine, the seafood cuisine, when we go to a hotel and we order fish, most of us don't know the names of more than 3 fish. And what do we want? We want fish without bones that can be nicely fried, put masala, kill the bloody taste of the fish, and labak it. So we don't have a diversity at all. We don't have a diversity in vegetables. It is potato, tomato, onions, maybe a little bit of brinjal, some snake gourd. It is the diversity of vegetables is more in India. It is less in Western countries. But here, if you look at the diversity of fish, it is very meager. It's about 5 or 6. Everybody wants shrimp all the time. But if you go to I get my fish only from artisanal fishers. I do not buy fish from the mechanized boats. And if you go to the artisanal fishers, you might not get fish to eat on a certain day because they come back with an empty net. On another day, it will be only one kind of fish, kavalai. Another day, it will be something else. So you have a diversity, but your cuisine is not developed well enough. Your tastes are not attuned to it. So if you really want to have a very healthy fisheries, then you also need to start working on diversifying the menu in people's houses. And the so-called trash fish are usually extremely nutritious fish. And sear fish, yes, of course, it tastes good. We have fresh sear fish. It's very tasty. But there's a lot of other variety that one can go in, and that variety can be given to you only by artisanal fisher folk. And so we need to figure out, just as we have organic food and naturally grown food, here we have artisanal hand-caught fish, which are less impactful on the environment. They are healthy for you because they are caught in a seasonal manner, and hence they are appropriate for that particular season. Okay. So that's just a quick introduction to how a fisher folk sees a thing. And this is something that I was excited to share because for me, my learning has been over the last 20 years, and I have a number of fisher elders who have been my teachers in this. And unfortunately for them, their way of teaching is through apprenticeship. So if you are a young fisherman, then you have to work on the boat, and they're not very talkative people. So you learn by watching. You learn by making mistakes and getting slapped. And then you learn by asking questions in certain other times. And so your period of tutelage is something like 10 to 12 years at sea. That is very dangerous learning because sometimes you make a mistake, you can lose your life. And this 10 to 12 years, I try to have it consolidated into small PowerPoint presentations. Fisher folk don't speak in PowerPoint presentations. They don't even tell you anything. They are bad teachers because they will not sit down and tell you things. You have to ask them. And you'll get an answer only to the question that you ask. If you don't ask them the next question, for that they won't answer. And they'll say, why did you not tell me that? Because you did not ask me. So it's not a need basis. Whatever you ask, there'll be a limited question to that. I'll just give you an example. I was working in this place called Ennur Creek. And in the Ennur Creek, it is one estuary in the south. And on the northern side, you have another very large lake called Pulicat Lake. And the Pulicat Lake also has an estuary. These two estuaries or river mouths are separated by an island that's about 24 kilometers long. Pulicat is a massive water body. The Ennur estuary is formed by the river Kosastalaya that is draining into the Bay of Bengal. So when the Kosasthalayar brings a lot of water, it pushes out through the Ennur estuary. So the Ennur estuary and the Pulicat lagoon are connected, are hydrologically connected through a water channel. So my question to the fisher folk is whether the Ennur estuary is solely for the use of the Kosasthalayar river, and does the Pulicat water come south? And if so, where does the Ennur water pushing north and the Pulicat water pushing south collide or meet? So then they said, oh, that is very easy. It meets near this bridge outside Adani port. So I said, okay. And does it always stay there? No, it does not always stay there. Then sometimes it moves south. Does it move north? Yes, it also moves north. So I just left it at that, saying that, okay, fine, it moves north, it moves south. Then another time I asked, does this water from Pulicat ever come all the way 24 kilometers south to Ennur estuary? They said, yeah, it does. So why did you tell me where it meets? Because you asked me where it collides. That's the answer I gave you. If you had asked me, does it come to Ennur estuary? I would have said yes. You never asked that question. So the thing is that you need to constantly ask, and over a period of time. So some of this information I get separated by a period of about 3 years. So in between, I have inflicted myself on thousands of unsuspecting people like yourselves, saying Ennur, the Kosasthalayar river and the Pulicat, Pulicat waters meet at this place. It is inaccurate. It's an incomplete information, but I have authoritatively passed it on to you, and you will go ahead and Chinese whisper begins. All because this fisherman did not share everything with me, and his simple reason was you didn't ask, so you don't get. But the more you ask, and over a period of time, you start getting to know the depth of understanding. So, for instance, what does the depth of the water have to do with the availability of fish? In the Ennur Creek, again, what he was talking about is that now the depth of the creek has reduced because of siltation and because of dumping of fly ash. And he says, therefore, there is no fish. So I said, why is there no fish? Because it is not deep enough. So I said, what does depth have to do with fish? So he said that if it's not deep enough, then the sunlight goes this far and it heats up the water. I said, what happens if it heats up the water? If it heats up the water, the fish go. Why do the fish go? Because when the water gets hotter, there is less oxygen in the fish. So he said the fish can't breathe when it's hotter. So this he will just say by saying, creek is shallow, therefore no fish. End of story. The rest of it is all inside his head. You have to put hook and bait and pull it out one by one. Okay. So anyway, that's just a quick introduction. Now I'm going to do a quick sharing of a little bit about the landward side. I mean, the previous presentation I understand was mostly about the seaward side, about the oceans and the ecology of the oceans. I'm going to talk to you more about the landward side and about the land use and the importance of that as far as the coast is concerned. All right. You guys can see this? Yeah. Okay. All right. So just in terms of, you'll be hearing a lot more about climate change, but climate change is not the only driver of the current ecological catastrophe. So when I say driver, it means things that are pushing us towards a driver of catastrophe means things that are pushing us towards an ecosystem collapse. There are many different factors. And out of these factors, the most important or significant factor driving us towards a very dangerous tomorrow is land use change. And what is land use change? When you have land of a certain kind, which is being used or which is being covered by which is put to a certain use. When that use is changed, it's called land use change. For instance, I have a forest area. Yesterday, the chief ministers of Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh have signed an agreement to submerge several hundred square kilometers of the Panna Tiger Reserve as part of the interlinking of two rivers. Ken and Betwa rivers will be interlinked, and what used to be forest will now become a water body, a reservoir. That's a land use change. Land use change can be for the better and it can be for the worse, in the sense that I can make I can convert, let's say I can bring down the Bombay Stock Exchange and have a wetland and a forest and a mangrove area over there. Or I can take the mud flats outside Mormugaon and expand the port. Both of them are land use changes, and one land use change has negative impacts and the other has a better positive impact in terms of environment, biodiversity, and the ability of land to protect you. So if you look at water, just a moment, sorry. In terms of water, as you see, a bulk of the water on the planet is salty, saline water, and there's a very small portion, about 2.5% of the total available water, which is fresh, and out of which is about 30% is groundwater. Only 1.2% is surface water, and even that surface water is largely held in ground ice and permafrost, which is not in places like India, unless you're looking at the Himalayas, where it is in the form of ice, but also in the Arctic and the Antarctic region. Again, even with other kinds of water, you have these glaciers and ice caps. Now, this is very important for us to know, because as these things melt because of global warming, they go and meet the sea and become part of the salt water. So you're losing out of your budget, the availability of fresh water is actually going down. At the same time, what we're also doing is polluting our surface waters, drawing out our groundwater, converting it into sewage and sending it into the sea, which means we are engaged in an extremely dangerous unidirectional experiment, which will result in disaster. It's already resulting in disaster, because with these with climate change induced changes, you have glaciers and ice caps and permafrost melting. With human induced changes, we have groundwater extraction, we have surface water pollution. So what this word Anthropocene means is that now humans have themselves or human activities have become such a big force that it is shaping the nature of nature. So how nature behaves, whether a river should run or not run, how much water it should carry, when it should be discharging, everything is controlled by human beings. Not controlled, is intervened by human beings. We started it by wanting to control, but controlling nature is an impossible task. And that we are now finding much to our dismay, that this is a very dangerous exercise. I'm sorry about the Tamil slide, but I will explain to you. So this is just the manner in which water behaves. All of you are likely to know this already, but I will just run through it one more time. That when water falls from the sky, it hits land, and its tendency is to go down with gravity and float down or flow down with gravity. So the first thing it does is it starts moving, soaking the soil. And the soil soaks differently depending upon the nature of the soil. If I have sandy soil and I pour 1 liter of water, the entire 1 liter of water will enter the ground. If I have clayey soil and I pour 1 liter of water, and the clayey soil has a lot of vegetation, then the vegetation's roots tend to make holes inside the clay, and so water will go in. Now, the same clayey soil without vegetation will absorb less, more of it will run away. If I have concrete, nothing will be absorbed, everything will run away. So for the same area of land, let's say I have a 1 square kilometer area of land. If the land use changes, then the amount of water that goes into the land will be different than for a different land use, and the amount of water that flows off will also be different. So if I have a 1 square kilometer of very built up area with lots of concrete structures, and if I have 100 liters of water pouring onto it, the entire 100 liters, or maybe 98 liters or 95 liters, will flow off. So you can then realize that the flowing off and the flooding of downstream areas depends a lot on the nature of your land use. If you have well open land, well vegetated, then no matter how much water you throw at it, only a little bit is going to be flowing off. So you're less likely to be flooded. The same area, if I convert it into buildings or hard structures, roads, etc., then less water goes in, more water flows off, and for the same amount of rain, you're likely to experience flooding. Water then flows. Water has a memory. It likes low-lying areas. It stays in low-lying areas. It goes down into wells, and then finally it finds its way through numerous streams and rivers, and eventually ends up in large water bodies like massive lakes, or it ends up in the ocean. When you come to the coast, you have another phenomenon. Not only is there an exchange of water between the river on the surface and the sea, but there is also an exchange, a tension between the water that is under the ground, the fresh water that is under the ground, and the sea water that is inside the sea. The sea constantly tries to move into the land, both above the land and underground through the underground aquifers. So what you have over here, can you see my mouse moving, my pointer? Yes? Okay, fine. So what you have over here in the brown is the water level. This line is the water level. And then you have, this is all land. This is the sea. On the eastern side or the right-hand side is the sea. And on top is the sea level. What you have over here between the, this is the groundwater level, and over here is an aquifer, which means it's an area that contains fresh water. Now, fresh water is fighting and trying to push the salt water away. That is represented by this line, which is a interface. This line can move up when the seawater pushes in, and it moves down when the fresh water pushes it seawards. How does that? So this is not a line that is static. This line is constantly moving. Every day it moves 2 times with the tide. When the tide is high, then the line moves up. When the tide is low, the line moves down. Then seasonally it varies. When it rains heavily, then there's more recharge of groundwater, and so this place becomes fatter and pushes the seawater away. If you have long periods of extended drought and no rains, then this area gets starved of water and loses weight. It goes up. So when it goes up, seawater moves into the land further, and that is called salinity intrusion. And this is very dangerous because it can damage your groundwater aquifers. Another way by which I can destroy my aquifer is by sinking a bore well and sucking out this water. If I suck out this water faster than it gets replenished or recharged, then again I will be starving the aquifer and the seawater moves in. Another way of damaging the aquifer is by covering the top of this land with beautiful resorts, a golf course, an airport, 8-lane expressways, bullet train, all those things. If I put on top of the land, then the water cannot enter. This will become thinner and seawater intrudes. So we are thinking about real estate over here, and the sea is thinking of real estate under the water, under the land, and it moves in. And once it moves in, your wells will have water, but you can't use it because it will be saline. You can't use it for agriculture either. There is another phenomenon. It is called coastal erosion, and that usually happens because of a phenomenon called littoral drift. And I will play a short video on this to explain that. But as you see over here, there's a movement of sand from south to north. This is the east coast, from the south to north. Now, sand is moving along this way. When I put a breakwater, like a harbor's breakwater over here, that breakwater will trap the sand. Land will grow on the southern side, and it will start getting eroded on the northern side. The phenomenon for this, I will explain through a video. But if there are people here from Trivandrum, And after this presentation is over, you can speak to Jason or anybody else from Trivandrum and ask them about the Virinjam Harbor, which is constructed a few years ago, and what it has done to the shoreline.
We will mainly focus on high-energy sandy beaches. Sandy beaches have three main areas or zones: the back shore, the foreshore, and the near shore. The back shore is the area of the beach closest to the dune. It is generally dry and only submerged during extremely high tide storms. The foreshore is the area between the high tide and low tide mark. This is the area of the beach that is exposed to the changing tide. Finally, the near shore is the area between the low tide mark and extends beyond where the waves begin to form. This is the area that is influenced by near shore currents. Within these zones, there are several important features. Berms are any area of horizontal expansions on a beach that run parallel to shore. They can be in any zone. The wide ones in the foreshore are where you will generally find sunbathers. Berm scarps are areas of the berm that have been eroded away by wave action, leaving steep spaces of sand. Racklines are present on some beaches and are composed of dead plant material and seaweed that have been washed up during the high tide. The algal rackline is an important component of stabilizing beach sand and offers a physical structure for many beach plants to take root. Algal rack is also an important habitat for numerous invertebrates, providing food for many shorebirds. Finally, the swash zone is the area that is immediately impacted by wave action and moves with the tide. This is where the water from breaking waves comes to shore and recedes. Important features of beaches is that they are constantly moving. A principal force on the beach is longshore drift. Have you ever swum in the ocean only to notice that you have drifted far from where you started? If so, you have been affected by longshore current. The longshore current flows parallel to the coast between the shoreline and where the waves break. The longshore current also influences waves, causing them to break at a slight angle to the shore. This angle is extremely important in transporting sand along the beach. As waves crash onto the shore at an oblique angle, sand, shells, and other particles are also pushed at an angle onto shore. As the wave water recedes, it washes down at an angle perpendicular to the beach, carrying those same particles with it. These actions create a zigzag along the shoreline. This zigzag is known as longshore drift and carries sand sideways along the coast, resulting in a net motion running parallel to the beach. Because sand particles are constantly being washed onto the shore, down again and up, beaches are constantly moving. The effects of longshore drift can drastically change the profile of the beach depending on factors such as the wind and supply of sediment. Longshore drift results in two important processes: erosion and accretion. Erosion is the loss of substrate from the shoreline. Accretion is the deposition of substrate to the shoreline. Because longshore drift results in the movement of sand from one place to another, the shoreline is continually being eroded and accreted. However, these processes may not always be equal, resulting in the net loss or gain of beach sediment. As longshore drift moves up the coastline, sand is going to be transported along the shore. Where there is a change in the coastline, there will also be a change in the longshore drift. In this scenario, sand is being eroded from point A and accreting at point B. Where the coastline changes, there is a loss of energy, resulting in the deposition of sand and the formation of a spit. Although these processes are natural and important to the dynamic nature of coastal ecosystems, they can be problematic for humans when erosion and accretion occur in unwanted areas. Extreme erosion events can lead to loss of homes, roads, and even the beach itself. Humans have dealt with these problems in varying ways with various ecological consequences. These methods can be divided into two categories: hard engineering techniques and soft engineering techniques. Seawalls are large walls that are placed along a coastline to prevent erosion. Not only are these walls expensive to install, but they are costly to maintain. Strong backwash undercuts the wall, destabilizing it. Anyone who has ever stood in a squash zone has experienced these forces. As you stand in a squash, the sand beneath your feet is displaced as you slowly sink. The same mechanisms are at play with seawalls. Additionally, the effects of erosion are simply directed elsewhere, and erosion is accelerated where the seawalls end. As the shoreline erodes and the beach narrows, there is a disproportionate loss of the back shore. This leads to a decrease in the number of habitat types, resulting in a loss of biodiversity, specifically within faunal maximum vertebrates that are important stable food sources. As the sink zones of the intertidal area are homogenized, there is a loss of algal raftlines and a decrease in intertidal organisms. These losses affect trophic cascades, leading to reductions in shorebirds and other important mesopredators. Additional organisms, such as sea turtles, also lose this vital habitat as nesting grounds.
And last.
Constructing groins is another method of hard engineering. Groins are low-lying walls that jut out to sea perpendicular to the shore. Groins work by interrupting longshore currents, thereby limiting the net movement of beach sediment. The beach on the upshore side of the groin is protected and may even grow, but the downshore side of the groin can experience severe erosion because the sand that would normally be deposited in this area is blocked by the groin, creating a sand deficit. Although the effects of groins are still not as drastic as other hard engineering techniques, the interference with longshore drift still negatively impacts biodiversity. Beach renourishment is an example of a soft engineering approach. Beach nourishment is the addition of sand to an eroding beachfront with the aim of widening the shoreline. Although this approach is generally considered more environmentally friendly, there are many negative consequences that can be exacerbated by factors such as the quality and quantity of sand used for the nourishment, the construction activity and technique, and the timing of the project. As sand is added to the beach, not only is the shoreline widened, but it is also thickened. Although many organisms can survive deposits of sand on the beachfront, heavy deposition can be fatal. Studies have shown that additions in excess of 90 centimeters are deadly for faunal organisms. However, for a nourishment project to be effective, deposits need to be thick. Most nourishment projects deposit anywhere from 1 to 2.5 meters of sand, resulting in a total loss of macro and faunal organisms. Similar to seawalls, extreme losses to the basal food web result in drastic consequences that can cascade at many trophic levels. The quality of sand is also an important factor in beach nourishment projects. The quality refers to things such as grain size, percentage of shell, and overall color. Adding sand to a beach that has different qualities than the native sand can be detrimental and has resulted in decreased species richness and abundance. For example, a change in grain size can result in beach compaction. Birds may have difficulty foraging because their bills are unable to effectively penetrate substrate. Burrowing organisms, such as various arthropods, may also be limited in their movement. Sea turtles have also been deterred from nesting on nourished beaches due to sand compaction after nourishment. Sea turtle nests are important sources of nutrient input to an already nutrient-limited system. In a high-density nesting area on the Florida coast, a 20-mile-long stretch of beach was estimated to contain 150,000 pounds of sea turtle eggs. Not all of the eggs will hatch, and not all of the hatchlings will escape from the nest chamber. As these organisms decompose, they provide essential nutrients to the dune system, resulting in stronger plants and contributing to the overall health of the ecosystem. Finally, the process of nourishment can be harmful not only to shore ecosystems where sand is deposited, but also offshore where sand is collected, resulting in the disturbance of two distinct habitats. As large, heavy equipment is used to collect, deposit, and distribute sand along coastlines, the beach is turned into a construction zone, full of noxious fumes, foreign chemicals, and loss of noise. Coastal areas are harsh habitats, constantly being restructured by wind and waves. The longshore current is just one of the forces that continually erodes and accretes the beach. The organisms in this ecosystem have adapted to deal with these dynamic conditions. However, their biggest threats are not wind and waves. Humans have tried to prevent coastlines from changing by armoring the shore with walls of concrete, rocks, and sand. These ambitions are not only expensive and impractical, they are also ecologically harmful. In our efforts to prevent change, we have simply delayed and exasperated it, resulting in massive erosion and accretion events that have unraveled food webs and destroyed critical habitats. The coast will continue to change, and so should we. We need to learn to live with nature, not against it, and develop techniques that will benefit both society and the environment.
Okay, then I have a question for you. What has been said in this is that the beach is a dynamic place, which means the particle of sand that you see here today will not be there tomorrow. It will move either north or south or east or west, depending upon the orientation of the coast and what is called the near shore current. The near shore current means there's a near shore zone. The near shore zone is the area between the high tide line and the area between the low tide line and the place where the wave breaks. And this near shore zone is where you have a river of sand moving in one direction or the other. So if you go stand inside, you dip your feet in the water. When you come out of it, you will have sand particles stuck on it, on your feet. And that is because it is not just water you're standing in. It is not just a river of water. It's also a river of sand that's moving in one direction or the other. So where is the sand coming from? So for instance, in the East Coast, we have the sand moving from the south to the north for a majority of the year, which is for nearly 7 months, and from north to south for 5 months, during which time Chennai gets its monsoon. It is a northeast monsoon. That season has just ended. Actually, in March, early March, the direction of the near shore current changed from north to south to north. On one particular day, all of a sudden, this current started running from the south. So when I have a net movement from south to north for 8 months, it means there is a net movement of sand from south to north, which means sand from the southern beaches are brought to Chennai, Visakhapatnam, Orissa, etc. So where does this sand come in from? Because every day, if sand is being taken from the southern coast, then the southern coast must become depleted. It is not being depleted. So what does it mean? Where does the sand come from? Where does the sea get the sand to move up and down? Is the question clear?
Yes.
It also comes back down during the monsoon season while the rivers start flowing.
Okay.
So from the top to the bottom south, from the north to south. So there is a balance of sedimentation in that form.
The rivers bring in sediment.
The rivers that, like Godavari, Brahmaputra, which again brings back the sedimented soil.
From where?
To the water that meets the Arabian.
Where does the Brahmaputra bring its sediment from?
Mountains.
Okay. Not just mountains, from what is called its catchment.
Yeah, catchment, sorry.
Okay, I think one more person had something to say.
Anyone else?
Oh, okay, fine. The person's sitting right in the center. That's okay. That's okay. No, don't worry. All right. So what's happening is rivers regularly bring in a budget of sand. Now, has that amount of sand that the rivers are bringing in reduced? Rivers bring in sand.
Yes, it has reduced because of the, sand exploitation that dams, sand mining at the rivers that has been happening.
Okay. Anybody else?
Anyone else?
Has the amount of sand coming into the sea brought in by the rivers reduced?
I'm not really sure specifically about sand, but at least with sedimentation, it does increase also if there's deforestation within the catchment area. So
Brilliant.
there's also increases.
Brilliant. So there are two things happening. On the one hand, we have like what Meghna said, Megha or Meghna? Meghna. So what Meghna said, that there is removal of sand from riverbeds, and sand happens to be the largest mined commodity or material on the planet. And so sand is being removed and put into beautiful buildings. And so that sand that ought to be reaching the sea does not reach the sea. The second thing that is happening is that there is more soil erosion and sediment that is brought in from deforested slopes. And that also washes in. So in any given river system, you would need to look at both these things to see, add and subtract and figure out how much, what is the kind of sand budget that is available. A third thing that happens is dams. When I construct a dam, you guys can hear me? So what I don't know if you heard me when I said that the third thing that also interferes with the sand budget is the construction of dams and check dams. There is this, supremely stupid notion, which even supremely intelligent, quote unquote, people like Dr. Abdul Kalam have said, which is don't let water go to waste. It is the dharma of the river, it is a dharma of the rain to reach the sea. To say that so much, like we just have our, the circus has begun in Tamil Nadu. We have our elections on 6th of April, and we have the manifestos. All of them are promising interlinking of rivers so that there is surplus water from one river can be brought into another river. One river is deficit because it is not meant to be a perennial river. The Kuvam, the Adayar, these are all seasonal rivers. They're not supposed to flow through the year. If they flow through the year, something is wrong. Brahmaputra and Ganga are supposed to flow through the year. If they don't flow through the year, then something is wrong. This concept of surplus waters and deficit rivers is a weird concept. It's not a natural concept. It is not an ecological concept. It is an engineering premise. And engineers are probably the single discipline that is most responsible for most of the world's problems. Because what they tell us as a solution is actually another problem. To solve that problem, they will have another engineering solution. And that way, the only thing it is a solution for is unemployment among engineers is solved by constantly converting everything into an engineering problem. If you tell them my grandmother's got arthritis, they'll give you an engineering solution for that. If you tell them something else about, two communities fighting against each other, they'll say build a wall between the two. So for flooding, they will say build a stormwater drain. For water scarcity, build a desalination plant. So everything becomes, and I will be dealing with this in some detail tomorrow when we talk about commons. What is the point I was trying to make? I'm sorry, I get lost whenever I speak about engineers. What is the point I was making just before that?
Sand budget.
Sorry?
Sand budget.
Sand budget. Okay. Well, no, I don't think that was it. I was talking about something after. Come again?
River linking.
Yes, that is right. That is right. So river linking, and also this whole thing about building check dams. So the Tamil Nadu government's, the Tamil Nadu political parties, all of them, including ones that have set up environmental cells, like DMK has an environmental cell, Makkal Needhi Mayyam, which is Kamala Hassan's political party, has an environmental wing. Then another group called Nam Tamilar Katchi, they have an environmental wing. And all environmental wing, unfortunately, are contaminated by engineering mindset. And so again, over there, they're talking about building check dams. Every 10 or 20 kilometers, there'll be a check dam. That check dam stops the water, supposedly recharges groundwater, and then allows that water to be taken away, and also traps sand. The water does not reach the coast. So when the water doesn't reach the coast, two things happen. It is not just water. Water flows with silt. So when water does not reach the coast, the silt does not come to the coast. If the silt does not come to the coast which is supposed to be the estuary, which is supposed to be at a certain level, will stop getting new soil, so it starts going down. That is called subsidence. When the land starts going down, it is called subsidence. Then we have global warming. What does global warming do? It heats up the ocean. When you heat water, the water expands. So that is one form of sea level rise. Second, when the globe or the atmosphere is hotter, then the ice melts. And as we saw, the permafrost and the ice caps and the glaciers hold the most of the fresh water. And when that melts, that volume of water comes into the sea, effectively raising the height level of the sea. So on the one hand, you have deltas, Godavari Delta, Krishna Delta, Sundarbans, the Gangetic Delta, Kaveri. All these deltas are subsiding. They're going down. When they go down, seawater comes in. Remember that seawater is the biggest, the ocean is the biggest real estate shark in the world. It wants all your land. And what we have, if our land needs to be secure, then you need to have very healthy land use. But what we call development essentially involves degrading land uses, or land degrading activities are what is positioned as development. We will talk more about this tomorrow. So you have a problem when we talk about damming, and the dam is placed in the highlands of Kerala or Karnataka for the Kaveri. I'm talking about the Kaveri. The fishermen in Tanjavur and Nagapattinam don't really see that as their problem. When the farmers in Tamil Nadu go and burn Karnataka buses to get water, because every three or 4 years, when it doesn't rain properly, the farmers get very upset. Then all the Tamil spirit will get really boiled. Then they will go and burn a few buses from Karnataka, hoping that by burning buses, you will somehow get Kaveri water. But for Kaveri water to come here, Kaveri must have water. And for Kaveri to have water, Kaveri's upper reaches, that is in Karnataka, Kerala, and parts of Tamil Nadu, there has to be vegetation on the hills. But the vegetation is being chopped down or being dammed. It is not seen as a problem in the coast. So the point that I'm trying to make is the coast is nothing without the hinterland. And the hinterland too depends a lot on the coast, because as the sea moves in, the effects of the sea will be felt even more violently. And the sea is not just a place where we go to the beach, sit down and have sundal. It is not that kind of a place. The sea is a very dangerous place. It has to be respected. You must be scared of it. Fishermen who go to sea are smart because they are scared. They always take precautions. They don't engage in bravado. And that is why they come back alive. I'm in this place called Besant Nagar. Every year we lose at least 5 or 6 young men, usually young men because they're more stupid, who go into the sea thinking it's a good, fun place to have a bath. They don't come back because the sea is vicious that way. So the thing that we need to notice is that the sea is constantly trying to take a piece of the land. We must be doing things to ensure that the land remains secure, because we can stay on land and we can have a healthy life only on land. But instead of that, what we're doing is changing the use of the land to make that land, which eventually makes that land more vulnerable to a whole range of problems. Here I'm talking only about the coastal problems, what comes from the sea. So on the one hand, we're doing that. On the other hand, all the other land degrading activities that we call development has led to accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere, has led to climate change, or has led to global warming. which itself is causing many of the problems to become even more intense. How much time do we have? Yeah.
10 more minutes. 10 more minutes.
No, I will take less than that, so we have time. So we have till 12:30, right?
Yes, yes.
All right.
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm just going to take, just going to run through this to see if there are any important slides. No, okay, this is good. What we will do is we will stop over here and see if there are any questions, comments that people have. One of the things that I'll throw open as a general question is, what are the kinds of, you know what Anthropocene is? I've just told you what Anthropocene is. It's in this age, human activity itself has become, it's like a new geological epoch. An entire, the Holocene is what we just passed. The Anthropocene is where nature's behavior is determined more and more by human activities. Okay, so in this Anthropocene, what are the kind of things that we must be concerned about coming in from the sea? What have you seen in your experience? And the second, what should we be doing to prepare ourselves to deal with this? Because this is not, the coast is not an issue that concerns only the fisher folk. The fisher folk might be poor, but they are the only ones who have some idea about how to survive with a erratic sea. The sea has always been, cantankerous, crazy, and so the fisher folk know how to deal with that. They've always been mobile. What about us? What do you think we should be doing different in order to be able to deal with all the seaborne problems that we are likely to see as a result of ecological crisis? I can take questions or comments or observations that you might have.
Hello, I'm Subodh. I just want to know about the inundation. Okay. I want to know about the sand inundation by the flood, like in terms of river or in terms of, the coastal area. The sand, brought by the floods, seasonal floods or something.
Okay. So rivers bring sand, and rivers tend to, they have these kind of, rivers are again like the sea. Water has a mind of its own. One day it will flow like this, another day it will take a different route to get to the sea. Engineers don't like that. They hate it when things don't walk in a straight line. If children are moving everywhere, they'll say, all of you form a line. Likewise, with the river, if you look at the Indian rivers and the development of Indian agriculture, till the advent of colonialism, Indian agriculture to a large extent has been flood dependent. So if you look at the delta regions is where the river flows very fast from the hills. It hits the plain and kind of slows down. And as the land flattens out, the river starts wandering and meandering and distributing itself. So in the initial phase, it has tributaries. Tributaries are streams, rivers, etc., that contribute to a larger river. And as it moves towards the plains, it does gather more water, but it also starts splitting into several sub-branches. And then between the sub-branches would be what are called floodplains. When the river is in flood, all the branches disappear. Everything is one ocean of water. And when the water runs away, the heavier particles, which is the sand, falls into the bottom. It fertilizes the soil. And once the water recedes, It is fantastic new fertilizer. Some of it is moved into the sea, and that is used to nourish the coast, up and down the coast. So now what happens with when the British colonialists came? There's a wonderful study by a woman called Vinita Damodar, by Rohan D'Souza, about the taming of the Damodar River, where the British wanted to free up more space for agriculture. And so, and they thought that what the hell is this river, which only for 9 months of the year, it uses one particular path. And then for 3 months, it kind of spreads everywhere. Why doesn't the river learn to go in a straight line? Because also, as far as engineers are concerned, the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. The river is lazy. To cover a distance of 1 kilometer, it will take 22 kilometers, up and down, up and down, up and down. The engineers don't like that. They tell the river that you want to take this water from this point to this point, I will straighten you. When you straighten that river, imagine the amount of sand and water it is carrying. That sand and water needs to be spread over a very large area, which is the delta, so that some of that water can go down and recharge your aquifer, and all that silt and sediment can go and refertilize your lands. But that is not allowed when you straighten the river or you build what is called embankments. These embankments then mean that the water is given a set route to flow through. Water couldn't care what you think. It will break the embankment, and that is called embankment-induced flooding. So your flooding happens as a result of your flood control measure. So what do the engineers do? They'll build another embankment further away. So if you look at places like Kosi or Damodar, they've just been covered with embankments. And the Kosi is a very, badly behaved river. Does not like to be told anything by anybody. And so every year in Uttar Pradesh and in Bihar, you have massive floods. And those floods have been created because of flood control mechanisms. So there are two things that are happening. So when you have water being constrained to move through a small channel, all that sediment will get deposited in that, which means the height of the river bed will increase. And that means that the water will easily flow out of the embankment. That is called flooding. But in this case, the flooding has happened naturally. The second thing that also happens is, like with Chennai floods, and I think I'll talk about it tomorrow, is that if you block the river in its path or occupy the floodplains, then you're making yourself more prone to flooding, because those are areas that the river regularly comes and visits and goes. And in that area, if you build, then you are definitely making yourself more vulnerable.
Hello. Hi, Niti, Vaishnavi here. I wanted to know a little bit about land reclamation, especially in cities like Bombay. How does that work, and what are the effects of it on fishing communities and the ocean?
Okay, so I'm not going to answer that. I want you guys to answer it. Use common sense and tell me what will happen when you reclaim land. What are all the different things that can happen? Start brainstorming. When you reclaim land, you are changing two places: the place from which you borrow and the place in which you dump. So now please tell me what are all the different kinds of things that will happen.
Niti, can you repeat that question again? Sorry.
Please answer Vaishnavi's question. And Vaishnavi, you can try answering it also. These things don't require experts to respond. You just need common sense.
The entire session was about how does it affect whatever Niti sir was saying, that how does it affect the coastal communities only. Rather, if the water is not flowing into the sea will not be producing a lot. So this water should come and flow in the sea. This water, if the land reclamation has happened, this water current will also be changing in the sea. which is solely depend upon fishing and other activities. So entire thing, whatever the land, the entire session which he was taking about, that what if you disturb anything in the land also, land use pattern, it will disturb more in the fishing. So more in the fishing in the sense, as he said prior, fishers are depend upon the traditional knowledge of ocean current and also the water currents and the ocean wind currents. So this will totally change the entire phenomena inside the sea also. This will also impact a lot in their fishing patterns and everything, which hampers their livelihood. Also, it will lead to more erosion. Land pattern is changed, erosion will happen, their habitats will be increased. Accretion happens, their habitats will also be closed. So this have a dual effect. So that's what the entire session, if you interlink the first what he said about fishing and the other morphology we speak, it will be interlinked. So that will be the answer to it. Thank you.
More responses.
For Bombay, what specifically I learned. Sorry. Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes. And also tell your
Yeah.
name.
Hi. I'm Radhika. So for Bombay, specifically, what I learned when I was covering the whole coastal road issue. So Bombay has the rocky intertidal zone. So you have the sandy one also, and then you have the rocky one also. And most of the coastal road is divided into two parts. Initially, it wasn't. I don't know how many of you know how far back the coastal road thing goes. So none of the projects, these infra projects that our government comes up with, are something that they have themselves thought of. Most of them are hand-me-downs from the British. So coastal road is one such stupidity which they wanted to build at that time and they didn't. And some idiot came along and said in around in the 90s or something that let's make this because we are having a traffic issue. And anything that you want to go do on the coast has to go through the MCZMA, which is the Maharashtra Coastal Management Authority, and the MOEF. And both MOEF and MCZMA said, no, you cannot do this. This is too stupid. And not only is it too stupid, it is illegal. And not only that, it is also unsafe. So the project from 2011 kept on getting rejected by both the authorities. What happens in 2014 is the government changes, center and state, you have BJP, and they sort of, I think, go about and say, we will make this happen. And suddenly, after 7 years of MCZMA saying that, no, I will not give you a, go ahead for this project, it suddenly gives a go ahead. And so does the MOEF. Both of them give go ahead. And so this is a brief the history of the coastal road project that I wanted to give. And what they did was essentially the agency that BMC, so coastal road is a BMC project. Now, why BMC is making infrastructure project is a different topic altogether. So what they kept doing when MOEF kept rejecting the project is they kept giving the same report over and over again by making tiny changes. So once this tiny change that they made was they broke the project into two parts. Project 1, Part A and Part B. Now the Part A project that is right now happening, where the reclamation is happening, is mostly on the intertidal, the rocky area, the rocky shore. And that shore, some professor from Xavier said, is 66 million years old. And a lot of the fishermen in the Worli Kolaba side, they depend on the rocky shore for their fishing. So around 5,000 families, 5,000 odd families their livelihoods have been destroyed because of the reclamation of that part. And even when they started doing it, what they were doing was they were putting big rocks on the tide line, and they were trying to keep the tidal water out. So when the high tide comes, they were hoping that the big rocks will stop the water from coming in, which did not happen. The rocks, every time they would put the rocks, every time the sea will take the rocks along with them. So they kept dumping rocks every time the sea kept on, taking it. So this is one thing in Bombay that I know. Another issues that I know is if you go along Navi Mumbai, so if you see the coastal line, so from Bombay if you start, you come all the way to Alibag and Navi Mumbai and all that area, and then you go to Uran. So Uran is a wetland and mangrove system. You don't see sandy beaches over there.
You don't see the rocky intertidal zone. It is mangroves and wetlands. And what is happening is because of reclamation that has been happening towards Bombay and all that side, all that water, the sea water, is coming to the Uran side. It's going over there, and the fishermen, the fishing villages over there are having floods in the month of February and March. So that is what is happening because the water is getting displaced from this end and it's going on to the other end. So they are having unseasonal floods. And I went to their houses, and the flood water, they are coming up to like 10 feet high. So like the entire house is getting submerged in water. So that is something that I learned during that whole, the Bombay, with regards to Bombay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Radhika. Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Avli, and I think I'm just adding to what Radhika said. If we go even before the coastal road project, or if you just look at the history of how cities like Bombay or Kolkata were made, we'll see like a lot of urban planning which was done by the British and other people. They basically took all the estuaries, all the spillways that we had, and they converted into real estate. And this is the same sort of planning that's going on. That it's the reason why we are seeing all these urban floods now, because we keep building in the same pattern over and over again, blocking everything which is there, breaking the natural flow of things, and then reclaiming sort of in the greed of land.
Okay, thank you.
Adding to Bombay, when you talk about Bombay or Mumbai, finance capital, actually it is not land space. It is 3 islands which have been joined together. So island phenomena, we should see about the island ecosystem when you talk. So 3 islands has been reclaimed and it has been formed as finance capital. So whatever pumping system you have, it will be very difficult to pump the entire water into the sea because you are reclaiming the sea. So we have to see when you talk about Bombay, we should have the island ecosystem, circulation with the relation with the floods.
I just wanted to add
Thank
one
you.
more thing. Sorry.
Yeah, pass it on, and short comments. I would like to hear from more people because the answer is there in the room. You guys have covered most of it.
வணக்கம். தமிழ்நாட்டில இருந்து வணக்கம். நான் தமிழ்நாட்டில இருந்து தூத்துக்குடியில இருந்து வந்திருக்கேன், கெபிஸ்டன்.
வணக்கம்.
இந்த இன்னைக்கு இருக்கிற சூழலியல் இந்த பார்வை எங்களுக்கு ஒரு புரிதல் கிடைக்குது. நான் என்னோட ஒரு சின்ன கேள்வி என்னன்னா, இப்ப இன்னும் பல திட்டங்கள் தமிழ்நாடு கடற்கரை ஓரங்களில் வர வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கு. இந்த அரசும் இன்னைக்கு இருக்கிற குளோபலைசேஷன், இன்னைக்கு இருக்கிற கவர்மெண்ட் நிறைய போர்ட்டு, இன்னைக்கு பிஷிங் போர்ட்டு, அதுக்குரிய சூழலையே மாற்றக்கூடிய வேலைகள் செய்யுது. அப்போ நம்ம இதை திருப்பி இயற்கையிட்ட நம்ம கொடுக்கறதுக்குள்ள வேலை என்ன செய்யணும்?
This question is that there's a lot of new projects that are targeted at the coast. How do we return these places, these spaces to natural, or restore these places to a natural state? I think it is the converse of what Vaishnavi asked. The word reclamation is very strange. It is not as if that place belonged to your grandfather and you're reclaiming it. It is a sea. So reclamation is a misnomer. You're claiming it. You're creating land out of a place which does not belong to land. It's a place that belongs to water. But the way we look at it, we look at a water body and say that somehow the real estate that has been covered over by water, the water has kind of stolen itself around this real estate, and so we must send away that water. So the whole process of draining, Kolkata and Bombay, both of them, and even parts of Chennai, have been a very important way of developing real estate, has been by draining wetlands, by removing the water from that, and by covering it with a new land and creating new real estate. We will be doing more about this tomorrow. To answer Kebistan's question, What do we do? If you look at what is happening around the country, virtually every single development project is being opposed by local people. In 2018, Rajnikant visited Thoothukudi and he made a comment that Tamil Nadu will become a graveyard because of all the people's protests. Because people are protesting against hydrocarbon extraction in the Kaveri Delta, they are protesting against the Kanyakumari port, they are protesting against the Adani port, they are protesting against Kamarajar port's expansion, they are protesting against dams that are to be constructed, against the oil pipeline, everything they are protesting against, and therefore Tamil Nadu will become.
I mean, we did not hear the complete thing, Niti. You should go
okay,
back.
okay.
You are talking
So,
about the protests basically. Protesting against, yeah.
That is right. So the point was, if you look at not just Tamil Nadu, but even around the country, there are a million mutinies, a number of places where people are protesting against quote unquote development. Every highway there's a protest against. Bombay, Delhi industrial corridor, protest against. Bullet train, protest against. Expansion of the Navi Mumbai airport, there was a protest against. Steel plant somewhere, protest against. What does it mean? It means that people are fighting against projects that degrade the land, that convert one kind of land into something else that does not have, that not only does not benefit the local people, but also makes the local people more vulnerable. So when a port project comes, they say this port will come up on top of the sand dunes, and therefore there'll be salinity intrusion, and our agriculture will be destroyed. Or the port comes and they will reclaim, like the Adani port, which is proposed in northern Tamil Nadu, wants to reclaim or wants to claim 2,000 acres of the sea. So what should we do? We should stop them. So there is, it's not what do we do is not a very difficult question to answer. How do we do it is a more difficult thing. How do you stop Adani? Because Adani gets what Adani wants. How do you stop them? So that is something that we need to talk about. Then once you stop them, so we have this campaign called Stop Adani, Save Pulicat. Pulicat is a lagoon. After we stop Adani, we still have to save Pulicat because Pulicat is dying even without Adani's help. So how do we stop it? How do we save it? If you want to save the lagoon, then you need to know what is the disease, what are the ailments, what is the problem. The problem is multifold. The lagoon is fed by the sea and fed by fresh water. The rivers that were bringing fresh water into the lagoon are all completely dammed up and dried up. And when they flow during the monsoons, they bring so much sediment that the lagoon's depth has decreased. And because the lagoon's depth has decreased, what the fisherman said, the water gets warmer, less fish in the lagoon. The other thing with reclamation is when you're talking about reclamation and dumping something into a water body in order to reclaim it, the surrounding water also gets harmed because there's an increase in suspended matter. The transparency of the water decreases, which means the makeup of the fish or the species composition in that area changes. If I'm smothering, the life begins at the bottom of these water bodies. If I cover the bottom of the water body with stuff that has been brought from elsewhere, that is a foreign stuff, then it effectively kills it. What you also have to think about, I think that Radhika was talking about, boulders being brought in, which means you're actually quarrying these boulders inland. You're damaging the ecosystem over there. You're harming the groundwater regime in the quarry site. And then you're causing all this pollution by transporting these large quantities of boulders from inland areas and coming and dumping it in your seashore. The sea takes it away and you do it again. Unfortunately, this activity keeps the GDP pumping up. It is like a perpetual GDP machine. And that perpetual GDP machine can be symbolized by a JCB earth excavator. It is constantly doing this, taking from here, putting it over there. Idhar kamal, udhar. And that is your concept of GDP. Because if the hills are not quarried, if those boulders are not transported, if the boulders are not dumped, and the sea doesn't take those boulders, and if we don't again quarry and dump the boulders in here, then our economy doesn't grow. Lorry contractors don't have work. Our politicians don't have quarry contracts. They can't get elected. You don't have mixie grinder in your house because they won't give it to you as a freebie. So you can see the amount of immense economic damage that is done if environmental damage is not done. So we will talk about this tomorrow again. Economic growth equals environmental damage. Sustainable economic growth is sustainable environmental damage. But when you have the word growth, growth is a consumptive exercise. It's a biological phenomenon. A thing is born, it grows, and it dies. Only in modern economic theory does growth not end. So I think that this, to answer Keviston's question, the very basic thing that we need to do is to completely redefine growth, which means we must be putting our minds to figuring out how do we get good things in life, what do we define as good things in life, and how do we get those good things in life so that future generations and other life forms are not affected.
This is Ria. I just wanted to say one thing, unpopular opinion, but in defense of land reclamation. My study sites, which are the Khazans in Goa, are technically reclaimed land, but it was land reclamation that was done about, the estimated date of creation of the Khazans is about 3,000 years ago. And the way it was done, the way it is supposed to, like this, they try to continue doing it like that, is using natural tidal cycles and allowing the river to continue flooding, but it's a controlled flooding. And it's actually a system that seems to have, for the most part, sustained life, sustained humans in a very beautiful way. And it's only now that, let's say, the engineers have come in and they're building concrete bunds, they're building, they're building these check dams, they're exploiting the system without an understanding of how it was originally designed, that the land reclamation is really becoming a problem over here. So, technically this entire space wouldn't exist. This place would be part of the floodplain of the Mandovi.
Thank you very much, Ria. I think that's a very nice, nuanced point. I do not argue for pristine nature. There's no such thing as pristine nature. Almost all of nature has been altered by the hands of mostly women, but also men, increasingly men. So if you look at a forest and the kind of species distribution over there, it has been altered by the manner in which men and women have gone in there, picked certain things, dropped certain other things, and by other life forms as well. Elephants are big pollinators. The elephants are, animals that tend to plant trees. So Khazan lands are a very good example of how low-lying areas have been made habitable but also to cultivate. But as Ria pointed out, there's also controlled, not controlled. There is it's a kind of living with floods, and so it is not as if they are designed to be land all the time. These are all fluid spaces. They are land sometimes and water sometimes. They are wetlands, and the vulnerability with that is okay in a kind of a steady state equilibrium. But what is happening is that these Khazan lands are already in a very vulnerable area. Now you have sea level rise and you have land use change on the gradient, on the uphill side, not enough water coming in, etc. So what we are seeing even in Goa is mangroves are moving inwards towards the land. From the coast, they are moving inwards towards the land because the salt is moving in. And as salt is moving in, mangroves are also following in, colonizing. So mangroves, salt marsh, both of them are moving inland. The Khazan lands were created to keep the salt away or to bring in a salinity gradient. And again, in the Khazan lands, it's not as if it's all fresh water. It is brackish. It's a different kind of an agriculture, polyculture they call it, because they also have agriculture, they also have fish and other things coming up in those areas. But we are seeing a lot of Khazan lands being damaged because of what is being done now. So a 3,000-year-old system is being undone in a matter of 50, 60 years.
Looking at all the land reclamation aspects, if you also go deep sea, there's something called as oil rigs that's coming up, right? And that's always been there. Or as development has been increasing, we also see more oil rigs coming up, and these are also very close to deltas. And the soil erosion because of these oil rigs are also quite high, and these are also the spaces where there is promotion of blue economy and deep sea fishing activities. So would you like to comment on this particular aspect?
Oil rigs don't have anything to do with deep sea fishing. They are two
Yeah,
separate
that's it.
things.
Yeah.
Oil rigs also don't cause erosion, but they do a lot
There
of
are
other.
studies which show that there is soil erosion because of oil rigs.
Talking about deep sea oil rigs, I do not see how they cause soil erosion. Maybe tomorrow's class, before tomorrow's session, if you could just send me something, I will look at it. Oil, before you find oil, in order to find oil in the deep sea, there is an extremely destructive process called oil exploration, and they use something called eco sounders. This oil exploration, the government of India has now said that it does not require environmental clearance because it is such a benign thing. They're not really doing anything beyond just exploring for oil. But oil exploration uses these eco sounders, which is like an array. There'll be like about 100, 150, 200, 250 different. It'll be in the form of a square grid with all these eco sounders, and each of these things is like an air gun that makes a very loud blast that is directed towards the bottom of the ocean. And this blast then reflects, it is collected by the sounders, the receivers, which then help the software tell you what kind of substrate there is. Is there oil? Is there water? Is there rock? What is there in the ocean bottom? These things are hugely problematic because most of the larger fish and mammals tend to use eco-navigation. And as it is, the sea is an extremely noisy place now. It is like living in the middle of a traffic jam for species that are very noise sensitive. They are quiet people or quiet things that need to have some very, very mild sounds come in from distances in order to communicate. And there are whales that tend to communicate over hundreds of kilometers. So now that is completely disrupted. And this is something from Nagapattinam in the Kaveri Delta. The fisher folk told us that at the time that this boat comes, there is no fish in the sea. The big ones escape, they leave, they don't come there. And for months after the exploration is done, they don't come there. So this is one huge problem. The second problem with oil rigs is that they sometimes have this thing called blowout. What happened in Bhagjan in Assam recently was that one of the oil rigs, the oil under the oil or gas under the Earth's surface is in extremely high pressure. That is nature's force. And here we have a bunch of corrupt engineers who are trying to contain that. So if you make any mistake, that force is going to come out, and that's called a blowout. Everything that's inside the Earth's belly is being thrown out violently. And that's what happened in Bhagjan, and you know how people could not contain it. The same thing has happened in the deep sea. You can look at a case called Deepwater Horizon. This is a company called British Petroleum, BP, and one of the largest oil multinationals with more than 100 years of oil drilling experience. And they have access to all the world's best scientists. For 3 to 4 months, they could not do anything because that is the force with which it comes. I mean, these are awesome things. Awesome means fearful. And here we are trying to meddle around with it. So it's hugely problematic, I think, what we are doing. But then the question is, what are you going to do without oil?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, that's true.
So then, no, I think that you can't, you say you can't live without it. Is that really true? But if you get it, then these are the prices that you have to pay. Not you have to pay, somebody else has to pay. So let's work this out. You know, what would be an economy that allows for life to sustain on this planet? Because what we have done just now is something that is not sustainable.